My name is Michael Guyett, publisher of the Lead Lag Report. Joining me for the hour is Alex Gladstein. Going to be getting deep into not just Bitcoin, but some of the problems that Bitcoin solves here. But Alex, introduce yourself to the audience and to me. Who are you? What's your background? How'd you get interested involved in Bitcoin? And what are you doing currently?
Sure. So my name is Alex Gladstein. I'm the Chief Strategy Officer of the Human Rights Foundation. I've been working with HRF since 2007 to help promote civil liberties in closed societies and dictatorships around the world. That's what we do. That's our mission. And throughout my career, I noticed how money was basically being exploited by governments to repress people. And that might be a frozen bank account. That might be a devalued currency. That might be a demonetized banknote. That might be a blacklist. That might be a government being, using its influence to sort of cut off an entire population from the world financial system. There's a lot of ways where people suffer when money is manipulated. And I just started to see how human rights groups, reporters, NGOs were having trouble just even running their organizations because, again, they may not be able to open a bank account. They may get their account frozen. Like, it might be really hard for groups in America or Europe to send a bank wire to, an organization, let's say in a place like Nigeria or Ethiopia or Cambodia. Often governments look very carefully at these transactions. And I learned from these organizations and these individuals, basically, modern day dissidents around the world. I learned from them about Bitcoin because they started to use it. Most famously, at the beginning, Julian Assange and WikiLeaks, obviously was sort of the first use case for Bitcoin was when the US government instructed all of its, all the payment processors under its control to stop servicing WikiLeaks. So WikiLeaks started using Bitcoin. So that was kind of the first use case, and everything else has followed from there very similarly. We did a fundraiser a couple of years later in 2013 for Ukrainians who were living in Ukraine under the corrupt rule of Yanukovych, and they were trying to mobilize into what would later be the Maidan Square protests. And they couldn't finance their activities because their bank accounts had been closed. So they asked us if we could do a Bitcoin fundraiser for them. So that was 2013. Around the same time, I would later learn in Afghanistan, a woman named Roya Mahbub was doing something similar where she was starting a software company with women employees, and it was basically really hard for her to pay women. Like, if she tried to pay them in cash, the male relatives would steal it. If she tried to have them go open a bank account, often they wouldn't be allowed to, and they didn't really have mobile money there. So she started using Bitcoin to give them financial freedom. So people all over the world started to, in small ways, opt out of the system into Bitcoin. Later, I started writing books about Bitcoin adoption and the global financial system. So my first book's called Check Your Financial Privilege. It came out a couple of years ago, and my new book that came out this year is called Hidden Repression. And they both basically look at the history of the dollar system, where it came from, how it works, and how it actually harms a lot of people around the world outside of our, let's say, I'm an American when I say our, I'm really talking about America, but outside of our borders. Classic example would be when the Fed raises interest rates. That makes dollar-denominated debt extremely expensive for a lot of poor countries. It basically crushes these countries when you have a rapid rise in interest rates. So this happened in the early 80s, which led to the third world debt crisis and basically mass suffering of people. And you're seeing something similar now where you had rates go from basically 0 to, 5, almost 6%. And you're seeing a lot of countries where basically the cost of living is just skyrocketed for people. They can't barely afford anything anymore. And you're seeing governments being toppled, revolutions. I mean, it's very similar to the 80s. So history rhymes. So my books try to explore that. Again, how did the dollar system come to be? I look at the petrodollar, the euro dollar. I look at all these mechanisms. And then I look at, why are people opting out into Bitcoin? And I guess to conclude this, just sort of the intro, the title of the Spaces obviously is provocative, but basically the thesis of my new book is that we used to have traditional colonialism where, European or Asian powers would traditionally, come in with violence and just kind of loot and pillage other societies. The point of old school colonialism was to get cheap labor and goods from somewhere else and bring it into your society so that you could keep cost of living down and inflation down and enrich your society. That was the whole point of the old school colonialism. That's why the Spanish went to find all the gold, and that's why the British went to loot India, etc. My argument in Hidden Repression is essentially that as old school colonialism became unacceptable and was phased out, 1960 was traditionally seen as the end of colonialism. What happened after that in the 60s and 70s was the rise of a new kind of colonialism through the IMF and World Bank, where instead of violence, you would use debt. And the Western powers would basically offer loans to dictators, typically in what was then called the Third World. And in exchange for getting the loan, the dictators would basically agree to structural adjustment, which meant like a variety of conditions that they would have to fulfill in order to take the loan, which usually included more taxes, sort of a recession in the banking system, and then a currency devaluation, and on subsidies to food and energy, things like this. So basically, this was a way of doing like wage devaluation at scale across the world to keep wages cheap elsewhere so that we could get goods more cheaply. It was also a way to make these other fiat currencies that were local to all these places be more affordable for us. So we would give out these loans, but that in exchange, we would get really cheap stuff and cheap labor. And that would keep our system going. And the reason I think Bitcoin's an interesting kind of escape for people is that if you were in the 1980s getting structurally adjusted in a place like Peru, which went through hyperinflation, you really had no way to get out currency if you were a lower middle class citizen. There was no real alternative. You were just stuck with the paper that you earned your wages in. And that paper was losing so much value that you were having to work more for the same amount of calories of rice or beef or whatever. And that was actually happening for over decades in many countries around the world. We like to think of society as moving forward and innovating and having deflation where we can get, more for less time. That's what we think of as human innovation. And that's true in many ways, but structural adjustment was so bad in so many places. And there's similar policies at work today where actually people are having to work more hours for a smaller amount even of rice or wheat or beef or et cetera. And that is something that, again, was not escapable back then. But today, people can get into Bitcoin. They can escape their fiat currency into something that's different, a 24/7 globally traded financial system that can't be stopped and that can't be devalued. So that's kind of what I'm looking into, and happy to be here today.
Talk about how financial repression behaved, for lack of a way of saying it, pre-1971. When you were on a gold standard, what was different? I mean, those in power want to stay in power. They're always going to try to repress, right? So how were things different under the gold standard?
I would just say that, and if you go back a little bit, again, pre-Bretton Woods, pre-44, traditional colonialism was very much alive. And that was the matter. That was like sort of standard in the 18th, 19th centuries. I mean, it was like that age of empires and colonialist behavior, right? That did start to decline in the early 20th century. And what was interesting is there's a lot of theories as to why we had the Great Depression, which of course Americans know well, but it was a global event. And people argue, did we go off the gold standard too soon? Did we not go off the gold standard fast enough? I mean, there's different camps have different theories between Keynesians, Austrians, etc. But there's some research which shows that there's another reason. And it makes a lot of sense, actually. If you think about the fact that the British Empire was the center of the world financial system in the early part of the 20th century, what was happening as you got into the 1920s was their like ability to sort of milk India and loot India was like declining. And when you have a slowdown in the amount of like cheap goods and labor that you can funnel out of a faraway place, it can have an impact at home. So in some ways, some people argue, there's a book called Capital and Imperialism that sort of argues this. They sort of argue that one of the big reasons we had the Great Depression and a huge economic crisis in the rich countries was because our ability to essentially loot from countries in the periphery was slowing down. And we lost control, and that led to a crisis at home. And then something I've noticed is something similar happened in the 70s, where in the 60s, you had decolonization, and you had a situation where the West used to control energy, right? Through the Seven Sisters. We used to actually control oil production. And then all of a sudden we didn't. OPEC did. And then because of that, because of the loss of control, because of the end of colonialism, they decided to raise the price of oil like really steeply. And that led to a huge inflationary crisis at home. And then today you're seeing a repeat again, where it's kind of like globalization breaking down really means like our ability to control prices elsewhere is breaking down, leading to more inflation at home. So there's like these patterns in history that we can see. And to your point, previous to the sort of 60s breakdown in the dollar system that led up to the actual Nixon shock in 71, you had, a Bretton Woods system that basically was very focused on repairing the world after World War II. So you had kind of the end of colonialism, and you had World War II, and you had the IMF and World Bank created at Bretton Woods in 44, really to fix the war-torn countries that were major actors in the war, right? The World Bank and IMF really were focusing on rebuilding the countries that were destroyed in World War II. A lot of loans coming from the World Bank to places like Japan and Europe. A lot of bailouts to places like Britain when they had a balance of payments issue, when their imports started to really outweigh their exports, the IMF would step in. And that was what it was supposed to be. It was supposed to be an organization that would be the international lender of last resort when the countries had a crisis. And the World Bank was supposed to be, someone who would step in and provide capital infrastructure projects where the private sector had no appetite. And, I think it's reasonable to say that in the 40s, 50s, and early 60s, that's exactly what they did. But what ended up happening is that as those countries got back on their feet and, sort of went past their economic productivity from the late 30s, and they sort of started to move forward, these two institutions, the IMF and World Bank, really no longer needed to let's say help the West. I mean, the West was moving forward. So as colonialism ended, they were kind of repurposed to quote unquote help poor countries. So you saw basically the IMF and World Bank tilt away from the Western countries and towards, let's say, like third world or developing countries. And that's a new thing that started to happen in the 60s and especially the 70s, was just this huge amount of loans to these countries that ended in a massive bubble at the end of the 70s and early 80s. So much so that there was like mom and pop banks in the United States ended up, making loans to countries that people had never heard of. There was just a massive, sort of build up in the banking system of loans to countries far away as part of this. It was kind of like a Ponzi scheme. I think people in the 70s realized that the only way to keep this going was to make more loans. I mean, basically the mechanism here is that you have these dictators that borrow and they don't pay back the loan. And that loan is an asset on a Western bank's balance sheet, right? So the question is, do you just take the write-off, or do you make a new loan and try to keep growing the balance sheet? And that's obviously where the incentives are. So over decades, what ends up happening is like all these poorer countries, again, usually ruled by unaccountable leaders that are taking out loans without asking the people or without having a vote. They're just doing it for their self-interest. They keep borrowing and borrowing and borrowing, and these balance sheets keep growing and growing and growing, and the sovereign debt bubble keeps growing and growing and growing, and it never gets paid back. Like, it's not designed to get paid back, is what you start to see. Like, the average developing country had maybe $100 million in foreign debt in the mid to late 70s. Today, a country like that might have $100 billion in foreign debt. So that's obviously not going to get paid back. So this system kind of grew out of that time period. So pre-71, it was much more about traditional military colonialism. And after 71, it became financialized. I hope that helps.
Yeah, and I think you explained it actually very well. And I was making the distinction between, other countries, frontier, emerging versus developed, I think is important. I do wonder your thoughts on sort of the different ways that Bitcoin is viewed. So there's the pure utility aspect of it, which I agree with, by the way, on sort of getting out of the system, especially when you're, a citizen of a country where it's either a dictator or there's outright repression as opposed to just financial repression. So that sort of usage versus, what you, I think, often arguably can see on the social media side, which is those that are advocates of Bitcoin purely for momentum. Can those two types of mentalities coexist? And the reason I frame it in that way is if you want to get out of the system, there does need to be a degree of stability in the mechanism with which you're getting out of the system. And if there's always this segment that's wanting to just play momentum and then as a result cause higher volatility in Bitcoin's movement, that makes it hard, right, to sort of have the confidence in the stability of that as the answer.
First, I would just point to gold. Like, in some ways, it's going to be similar to gold. Like, the overwhelming volume of gold is held by centralized institutions and wealthy governments and people, overwhelmingly. But that doesn't mean that it can't be a good tool for anybody, right? So it's something I think to keep in mind. As for Bitcoin, again, it's being born. It's really new. It really only started having a price in 2010, 2011. I mean, it was only worth $10 or so, about a decade ago. So it's extremely new. It's growing. So I would just keep that in mind, that it's a very, very new thing. And very, very few people have thought about it very carefully. Most people dismiss it or don't kind of research it very closely. So that's just something to keep in mind. But I basically have advanced a thesis where I think that Bitcoin is like basically a Trojan horse for freedom. That's like my general argument, is that most people adopt Bitcoin for self-interest because they think it's going to be a good kind of speculative investment, or that it's going to be a good thing for them to buy. Now, they might be wrong. They might be right. Personally, I think Bitcoin is not a very good short-term investment. I think it's a very, very good long-term investment. But people buy it for different reasons. And overwhelmingly, most people buy because of speculation or because they think it's going to like hedge against inflation or whatever. Only a smaller percentage of people who use Bitcoin are using it because it's like the only currency they can earn, or it's the best way to send money via remittance, or for political reasons. I mean, those are all essential reasons to use Bitcoin, and they're really important. And it's what I work on. But I'm fully aware that it's like sort of a minority of the total volume of Bitcoin stuff going on. The cool part is that it doesn't really matter. Like the point of Bitcoin being a Trojan horse for freedom is that much the Trojans bringing in the Greek horse, because they thought it was one thing, it ends up being another. All these speculators and all these people on TV and all these institutional wealth managers and governments, like, they do not care about freedom or human rights or privacy or civil liberties. Most of them don't care about them at all. In fact, a lot of them don't like these values. But that doesn't matter, because they're going to go out and adopt Bitcoin because over time, it's going to be a very good investment. So out of self-interest and greed, they're going to go get Bitcoin, or they're going to experiment with it or speculate with it. But that actually drives up freedom for other people, is the cool part. Like, the more people that get involved with Bitcoin, the more we talk about it, the more it gets adopted. And again, it doesn't matter what reason, it helps everybody else. Like, there doesn't need to be any altruism here, is the interesting part. So within the number go up, Trojan horse hidden inside is freedom go up, is my kind of general outlook here. Like that's how we will eventually have like widely distributed open source money in the world that nobody controls, and that can be used by citizens without their governments, debasing or deplatforming them. So that's kind of my theory there.
How does it jive with taxation as a form of repression? Okay, we can debate the inflation hedge discussion, right, from here tomorrow, but the taxation side is a much more direct way of repressing citizens, right? So how does that factor into the thesis around freedom? Because if it's about getting out of the system and they still want to tax, Bitcoin, right, in whatever country you're in, right, then there's a little bit of disconnect there, I think.
I think in a lot of the countries that I'm talking about, very few people pay taxes at all.
No, that's a fair point. Yeah, no, right.
Yeah. And, obviously, if you're living in a dictatorship and you're doing activism, your entire work is illegal. So you're obviously not going to pay taxes on that income. But like in a Western country context, let's say America, I think that over time, taxation regime is going to have to change probably. I think it'll be more likely and more practical if Bitcoin does become a bigger and bigger part of the global financial system, which it clearly seems to be on track to be doing, I think you'll see more kind of like, more kind of consumption tax, more kind of VAT tax, more of the tax base harvested by governments will be related to transactions. I think like income and wealth taxes will be just to be realistic, it'll be harder to track and harder to enforce. So, I mean, I think you'll see a lot of kind of VAT style stuff going on. Those kind of taxes are not impacted by a shift to a Bitcoin system. I think there are other kinds of economic activity that'll be much harder to have oversight into and to enforce. Much like the world economy changed when we went from, basically people using an informal economy that was unsurveilled completely for their transactions. Let's say go back 100 years, obviously people were just using coinage and paper notes pretty much for daily stuff. Now everything's digital and people are using credit cards, things like that. Taxation and law enforcement had to change. I think it'll have to change again, probably in the future.
Let's talk about some examples just in the last several years of, certain areas of the world where there's repression and adoption has been increasing. What I guess countries or what areas are showing the most interesting adoption where you can maybe track some of the benefits of what may be happening in a transition by the people?
Yeah, in general, it's tough to get a lot of good data on Bitcoin adoption. People aren't necessarily willing to talk to pollsters about their private financial matters, especially in difficult political climates. Like it's going to be sort of hard to get good estimates. But from what I've seen in the industry, which are, numbers used by Bloomberg, numbers used by Statista, numbers used by different kinds of polling companies, what's very clear is that the adoption of cryptocurrency more broadly, which, overwhelmingly means Bitcoin and stable coins, is highest in countries that have seen the most monetary repression. This is very, very simple. It looks like, generally speaking, from a bunch of different studies I've seen, you look at internet users age 16 to 64, something like 10% of those people in the United States have used cryptocurrency in one way or another. Now, maybe I've seen other data showing that being higher. I've seen even like 1 in 5 Americans, but let's just say it's 10%. I think that's a number I've seen in a bunch of different stats. That number is 20 or 30% when you go to a country like Argentina or Nigeria or Indonesia or Pakistan, et cetera, et cetera. So countries that have seen monetary repression, where the fiat currencies lost a lot of value really quickly over the last few decades, those countries tend to have much higher adoption rates of Bitcoin. So that's just kind of what we're seeing. And I think that makes sense. If you have the dollar system and you live in America, your desire for Bitcoin is going to be like way lower because you have a variety of options at your fingertips for, using a good currency, having easy access to the stock market, bonds, things that traditionally have done pretty well in the last few decades. If you live in Argentina, it's very different. Like dollars are hard to get. The local bond and stock markets are very poor in their performance. So something like Bitcoin's more appealing. So I think it just is very rational. This is the data we're seeing.
I feel like we should talk about El Salvador, which, has no longer, at least I'm not seeing too many headlines around El Salvador and Bitcoin City around that excitement in 2021, I believe it was. What's gone on with Bitcoin adoption in El Salvador? It seems like just a lot of the hype seemingly died down last year and a half or so.
I think that's just because it's a bear market in Bitcoin, and there's not as much interest in it. I mean, compared to the summer of 2021, it was intense. I mean, there was an overwhelming amount of interest in Bitcoin that year. Today, it's like a desert in comparison. So there's not going to be as much interest. But that was a crazy year. I went down there. I visited El Salvador right before the Bitcoin law came into effect. Did a bunch of interviews. I wrote a piece called The Village and the Strongman about it, because I think it's a really fascinating topic. My own view is that there was organic community in a small beach town in El Salvador that lit the fire, that lit the spark, and that the government eventually saw and thought was interesting. My point was kind of like this was an organic phenomenon, a ground up phenomenon of people who built a community. And later on, the government, saw that and then tried to use that for their own ends. If people want more detail on that, they can look up The Village and the Strongman. It's also a chapter in my book, Check Your Financial Privilege. But basically, I think that is pretty smart for El Salvador to have adopted Bitcoin as a second currency. As far as I've been able to tell, no one's forced to use Bitcoin. The government has tried to do some public works projects to build infrastructure that is compatible with Bitcoin. I think this makes a lot of sense. There's several million Salvadorans who live in America who do remittances. I think it makes a lot of sense there be Bitcoin, that the government be interested in helping its citizens save money and have therefore more money flowing back into El Salvador. So that was always like something I thought was good. The Bitcoin law, I thought that experiments with potentially, we'll see, but potentially mining Bitcoin with the volcanic energy they have, which is stranded. It's in the middle of nowhere. I think there's not a whole lot they can do with it right now for infrastructure, electricity. Like it can't power people's homes because nobody lives there. But guess what? With Starlinks, you can mine Bitcoin there and the government can earn a lot of revenue. So I was excited by that. Also interested in this volcano bonds idea where maybe you could sell bonds based on renewable energy, proven renewable energy reserves. I think a lot of these ideas were exciting. Obviously, they haven't really delivered on those yet. I think those ideas remain exciting. I have a lot of criticism of the Salvadoran government, but it's not really related to Bitcoin. Like I think the Bitcoin stuff has been smart and I think will be proven pretty visionary in the future. Fortunately, I just have other issues with the government being autocratic and with the current leader, essentially like trampling the Constitution to run for another term and persecution of journalists and spying on people who criticize him and obstructing the justice system and stuff like that. So I think it's a mixed bag. I think the Bitcoin stuff they did will end up being seen as pretty visionary, even though today in the bear market, it's been kind of forgotten.
Do you think that the efforts or maybe direction towards more regulation laws around Bitcoin, which you can argue is a way of actually bringing that which is outside of the system into the system, do you find it to be a net positive, or are there unintended consequences that could throw off sort of Bitcoin as a solution to the debt colonialism?
Well, I think that it remains to be seen, first of all, whether Bitcoin can actually help countries escape from debt colonialism. That's obviously hugely theoretical. What's not theoretical is that it can help individuals escape from debt colonialism. That's proven. That happens all the time right now. That's happened over the last 5 years in a huge way. That's real. That is just, a phenomenon that is ongoing. Again, we don't know whether it allows actual, countries to escape. Balaji Srinivasan he coined this, I believe, but it was sort of a little bit of a cheeky joke about, the Washington Consensus is obviously what most people call neoliberal reforms and kind of structural adjustment stuff I was talking about. You have to do the Washington Consensus if you're going to take this loan, right? There's a joke where, going the Bitcoin way would be the Nakamoto Consensus, which is a kind of a double meaning because it's kind of a riff off of the Washington Consensus, but it's also the technical term for sort of like proof of work mining in Bitcoin, what powers the whole thing. So I think you may see countries, follow El Salvador and go on to some sort of Nakamoto Consensus eventually. But that's massively theoretical. I think what matters today is what are governments doing, with regard to Bitcoin. I've always thought it was very impractical that governments would attack Bitcoin technically. There's all these people who always say, the governments are just going to attack Bitcoin. They're going to 51% attack it. None of this made any sense to me. The incentives aren't really there. It's very difficult to do. What makes a lot more sense is what we actually see is that governments attack Bitcoin users. And you see this everywhere. So you see governments try to make it illegal for you to exchange fiat currency for Bitcoin. This has happened in China, in many other countries, in Nigeria, in India, it happened. Then it was reversed by the Supreme Court there. I think the obvious route a government's going to take if it starts to get concerned about Bitcoin or other cryptocurrencies is it's going to do sort of laws that restrict your ability to interact fiat currency with Bitcoin. And that's, again, something we've seen time and time again over the last 5-6 years, starting with the CCP in China and extending all over the place. Like dictators are really not going to, I think that there is like some short-term stuff you may see with some very isolated regimes, maybe trying to use Bitcoin to get around sanctions. That's I'm sure that's happened. I'm sure that's possible. But like medium to long term, like people having control over their own money is very bad for dictatorships. So I think you're going to start seeing a pretty draconian response to Bitcoin users all over the world. I think this is going to happen even in Dubai, UAE, definitely in Saudi Arabia. I think you'll see a lot of governments try to have their cake and eat it too kind of thing, where they're, they'll buy Bitcoin for themselves and their cronies, but they'll try to prevent the average pleb from using it. This is kind of like what Putin is trying to do. So Putin's like, from what we can understand, maybe there's talk about the Russians using Bitcoin in some way eventually as an alternative to fiat currency or something like that for oil trade. Highly speculative. But what's not speculative is that Putin signed a law last summer preventing Russians from using Bitcoin and cryptocurrency for payment. So I think what you'll probably end up seeing is these like authoritarian regimes maybe try to use Bitcoin for their own ends, but try to prevent their populations from using it. The good news is that's not going to work. It's like impossible to prevent a huge population from using Bitcoin. It's even impossible, as we've seen from a huge, well-resourced, very repressive, very technologically advanced government from preventing Bitcoin mining from happening, which is obviously way more hard to hide than usage. So in China, 2 years ago, the CCP banned Bitcoin mining essentially, and we saw the network power extended into the Bitcoin network drop like 70% in a matter of weeks. But guess what? It came back. And now today there's a very non-trivial amount of mining happening in China, sort of regardless of what the CCP thinks or says. So kind of like the life finds a way thing. Like, I don't think these governments are going to be able to stop it. So it's just going to continue to expand.
I want to expand a little bit on the IMF and World Bank. Presumably they're talking about this, even if it's not open, right, on the back end. I mean, if there were going to be some kind of a coordinated response, for like what I was saying, it to Bitcoin adoption, what would that even look like?
I think that so far it's been minimal, but the IMF was not very happy about El Salvador adopting Bitcoin. That was very clear. And again, that seems straightforward. Over time, Bitcoin represents a way for governments to be more sovereign, to avoid the debt trap that the IMF and World Bank have put so many countries in. This idea that you can take some resources that you have and start harvesting coin through renewable energy reserves that almost every country has. Almost every country has something. It might be hydro, it might be solar, it might be wind, it might be geothermal, etc. And today, all these countries, to be able to buy oil or tractors or machinery or fertilizer, they basically have to get dollars. That's how the world economy works. They cannot pay for oil or tractors with their own currency. That's not how it works. And they can't just, contra what the MMT people think, they also cannot just buy a bunch of dollars with their fiat currency. That causes massive inflation in their countries. So what they do is they have to structure their economies to sell stuff to the US or its allies so they can get dollars in their accounts so that they can pay back their debt, which is denominated in dollars, and so that they can buy oil and factories and try to build industry. So currently, like the world's reserve currency is produced by one nation, and it's like very permissioned and gate-kept. And you have to basically be on good terms with the US to get some, right? So think about a different world where the world reserve currency is something that any country can just generate from an energy source. I think that becomes really interesting. And I think it allows a lot of developing countries to have a lot more say over how they develop, actually. I'm pretty bullish, like long-term, on Bitcoin doing that. But in the meantime, the IMF, was not very happy about what El Salvador did. They would prefer them to continue to just basically borrow from IFIs instead of do Bitcoin experiments. And in Argentina, there was one of the terms to one of the more recent loans that Argentina restructured or borrowed was that they would crack down on Bitcoin and cryptocurrency adoption. That's something the IMF asked Argentina. It's like in a document that you can read. So I think there's definitely going to be a coordinated response from lending institutions, basically telling countries that if you want our money, you're going to have to really limit Bitcoin and cryptocurrency, usage in your countries. So yeah, I think there will be a coordinated response for sure.
Speaking about just kind of, battling colonialism, in these countries where citizens are repressed, I've got to assume that there are difficulties in sort of properly conveying that Bitcoin is a way for them to do that, right? I mean, we're privileged in the West because we have resources, we have information available at our fingertips at every moment. In other countries, you find that the general populations are less aware of Bitcoin compared to more developed economies.
I don't know about that. I'm not sure. I went to the Africa Bitcoin conference in Ghana last December, and I was pretty shocked by the diversity of Bitcoin users and entrepreneurs and NGOs from so many countries in Africa, from Benin, from Somalia, from the DRC, Malawi. I mean, it was really, really impressive. So I think there's like pretty good and rising Bitcoin adoption all over the developing world. And again, to my previous point, it may even outpace the adoption rates in advanced countries, again, because they don't have any better options. And this is, one reason I think education and hands-on training and public resources is such an important thing to focus on right now. People need to learn about this. Like, it's vitally important that people in developing countries, I think dictatorships, learn about how to use Bitcoin if they wish to use it. I think it should be voluntary. I don't think anyone should force anyone to use it, but people should learn about it. Ironically, I think there's been some really sharp people that I've been in touch that don't see a conflict between Bitcoin and, they use it in their struggle against colonialism. Like in West Africa, there's Bitcoiners who see it as a way to get out of the French colonial system. Like, France still operates the currency system for 14 countries in Central and West Africa. It's called the CFA, the CFA currency. It's a colonial franc currency regime that's been in place since World War II. And it's allowed France to sort of milk these countries for resources and cheap labor. And it's been a place for France to sell, it's finished goods. It's a monstrous system. And people are trying to opt out with Bitcoin. And they don't see any, let's say, conflict there because they just know that Bitcoin is a good tool. But among people in the West, I think there's, going to be a lot of moral confusion among chartalists and Marxists. I think they're going to have a hard time with Bitcoin because they believe that the state creates money and controls money. And Bitcoin is just an obvious, scientific proof that the state does not control and create money. So I think they're going to have some problems adopting Bitcoin, even though it's a really good technology to preserve wages for workers and to fight back against essentially a lot of the things that Marx talked about, basically. So anyway, I think that's going to be interesting to watch.
How important is oil and how oil is denominated, obviously, in dollars, petrodollar dynamic? How important is that to Bitcoin's growth or pace of growth? I remember, a year and a half ago, I had Anas Al-Haji on one of these Twitter spaces. He made this point that, first of all, the real reserve currency is not the dollar, it's oil, right? Mm-hmm. And Bitcoin is not of size to,
sure,
be the threat, right, to the dollar from that standpoint.
I mean, of course not. It's too small. It's, what is it, $500 billion right now? I just think people should be a little more realistic. There's a really good essay written by Alan Farrington called Wittgenstein's Money. And the idea is to just run it like a thought experiment. What would happen if a digital currency went from zero, meaning it didn't exist, to world reserve currency? What would happen? Clearly, it would take a long time. It would go through a lot of trials and tribulations, and it would be slow, but it would get there that. It would not be a straight line, and it would not be after 1 year fully globally adopted. And it would look a lot like what Bitcoin is doing now, is kind of the idea, the point. In the last 10 years, Bitcoin has gone from essentially a niche internet science experiment to something that's used widely by people in every country on earth. It is pretty amazing what's happening with it. And to ignore it or dismiss it because it's not yet the world reserve currency, or that it's not yet used by countries to settle oil transactions, is super silly because like you don't go from zero to settling oil transactions. That takes most currencies a very long time. I think that the oil market is going to be very interesting. I think eventually oil will be priced in Bitcoin. I don't see any reason why it wouldn't be. I think that could be decades away though. And for now, it'll be priced in dollars. And I'm someone who doesn't think super highly of like the BRICS ability to challenge the dollar. I mean, yes, I see de-dollarization in a way, but like the dollar will just remain obviously the most convenient way to sell this stuff. You're even seeing a lot of these countries that, talking about de-dollarization. They're still trying to get dollars and trying to search for dollars and try to use dollars. So I think we have a long way to go here with this dollar system. And yeah, the dollar's tie to oil was a very, very important thing. And I've written about that. And I think that was really key to why the dollar is so strong today is the petrodollar system. And it remains very important. I mean, it's got big downsides. I wrote a piece about this. It's in my Check Your Financial Privilege book as well. But like the United States relationship with the Saudi government is, in my mind, morally offensive, and we should not be supporting this regime, which tortures female political prisoners and essentially has destroyed Yemen and has funded extremist Islam all over the world for decades. And, 15 of the 17 9/11 hijackers were Saudi, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's really shameful that we've had to protect this country, that we've had to protect its rulers. And that's because of this agreement that we made in the 70s, in 73 and 74, between Kissinger and Nixon and the Saudi government, that they would price oil sales in dollars and they would take those earnings and recycle them back into treasuries, and that in exchange we would protect them. And I think that that's fortunately still sort of the case today. And I would not complain if that system broke down. And I also don't think that America will be like weak if we move towards Bitcoin standard. Like I don't buy that at all. I actually think America will be pretty strong because America's founding values resonate with Bitcoin's founding values, which are free speech, private property, open capital markets. Like this is something that the United States is capable of resonating with. I really find it hard to believe that Putin's Russia or Xi Jinping's China are going to be able to be compatible with that. Like they require censorship and confiscation and closed capital markets to make their systems work. So I don't think they're going to like jive with a currency that's open and unstoppable. Like that's going to undermine them enormously. Whereas I think it could put important checks and balances on a democracy, but it could actually improve democracy over time. So I'm pretty bullish on Bitcoin for the United States and it helping to make us a better country.
Alex, for those who want to read more of your thoughts or your content in general, you mentioned the book that's coming out. Where else can people turn?
Yeah, you can follow me here. Social media. There's also another social media platform called Nostr that I post on that is interesting. You can find me there. Again, my books, thank you, are Check Your Financial Privilege and Hidden Repression. Those are on Amazon and also on the Bitcoin Magazine store if you want to buy them with Bitcoin. And you can find me at the Human Rights Foundation's event series. We have an event coming up in New York in September called the Oslo Freedom Forum in New York. We have our flagship Oslo Freedom Forum conference in Norway in June. And I'll be speaking at the Indonesia Bitcoin Conference and the Africa Bitcoin Conference later this year.
Good place to wrap this conversation up. Everybody, please make sure you follow Alex. Again, this will be an edited podcast on all your favorite platforms under Lead Lag Live, and hopefully I will see you all again tomorrow. Thank you, Alex. Appreciate it.
All right. Take care. Thank you so much. Take care.
Cheers, everybody.